Welcome to FailCraft, the podcast where we dive into the messy, real side of success and explore how setbacks become the stepping stones to growth and clarity. I'm your host, Ezekiel Iferia, and today's guest is Dr. David Marcos. He has spent 40 years as a clinical psychologist helping families under stress. He noticed a massive pattern of failure in modern parenting. Most people are trying to raise kids using the same techniques their parents used on them. But the world has changed and those old tools are broken. This leads to what Dr. Marcos calls being filled up, where a child is so overwhelmed by emotion that they crash. He is the author of Parent RX and an expert in high conflict families. He's here to talk about why because I said so doesn't work anymore, how to help a child empty out their stress, and how to become a soothing presence even when you want to scream. Dr. Marcos, I am very excited and honored to welcome you to FieldCraft. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Ezekiel. I appreciate it.
It's great to have you here. So let's get started. You believe that a major cause of family friction is that we are using outdated techniques. We try to parent the way our parents did, but it fails with today's kids. So why do those traditional methods stop working in modern world?
Well, because how we were parented can vary, obviously, in a lot of different ways. There are sometimes cultural or familial patterns to parenting. You've heard of the English stiff upper lip, where we don't express emotions. Or then you can go to the opposite extreme where you can watch, My Big Fat Greek Wedding, where they're always expressing their emotions and they're talking with their hands. And, so that's part of it. But most of it is because people don't really understand about emotional communication. If you don't experience it as a child, at least proper emotional communication, then you don't have it to do with your own children. So when I explain about the being filled up and emptying out, I think this is what's important, and also being a soothing presence. I'm going to take them in this order here. I'm going to talk about the soothing presence first because that's really key to being able to be an emotionally present parent. Okay, I put it that way. A soothing presence in its simplest form is simply somebody who is okay when we're not okay. When we think about the people that we turn to when we're upset, it's usually very particular people, friends or family, but these people are invariably okay when we're not okay. And so what we kind of do is use these people, and as I say with the children, we kind of borrow their okayness in order to be able to, empty out what we're feeling in their soothing presence. Okay. And that process of emptying out, which I'll get to, like I'll explain in a few minutes, gives us what I call a safe emotional distance from what's bothering us. When we're feeling an intense emotion, it's inside of us. And I call it an emotional space. But before I get to that, I use the term soothing presence rather than soothing person. And there's a reason for that. Uh, to be a soothing presence, you need a soothing environment. Parents are human beings. If they're all stressed out, they're going to react to their children rather than respond to them. So there's lots of things that impede, or actually the term is impinge, upon a family that can get in the way of parents being a soothing presence. It could be job stress, financial stress, a difference in parenting styles between the parents, marital difficulties, whatever it is, that the stress level, gets in the way of being a soothing presence. So I often talk to the parents that I see about lifestyle. you know. In this day and age, unlike previous generations, everything's a two-income family. I think it's 90 something percent of us are involved in two-income families. Plus, we have like, computers and social media. There's a lot of things, you can't just leave your work at the office anymore, like back in the 50s and 60s. Now you're always working because you've got your laptop and you've got your cell phone, and we're inundated by these impingements, and it really makes it difficult for parents to be present for their children, emotionally present for their children. So that's one thing I talk about. Is that clear what I've just explained?
Yeah, yeah, it is, Dr. Marcos. So, you talk about a child being filled up with emotions. So, when a kid is having a meltdown, we usually try to stop it immediately. So, are you saying we actually need to let them empty out that emotion before we can fix anything?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying, Ezekiel. Um, Let me explain the emotional space. That's another term that I use in the book Parent RX. We all have an emotional space within us. We usually point to our chest, our heart, when we think about our emotions, but obviously it's associations in our brain that really guide our emotions. And this emotional space gets filled up with intense emotion, anger, fear, apprehension, anxiety. In fact, with little children, it can even be the intensity of glee when they get this, nice little toy that they just got. It's the intensity of the feeling that fills us up. And we know when we're filled up. That's the key here. We know it. We even have phrases that describe it, like "I've had it up to here," or "the straw that broke the camel's back." It's we know we're filled up. And what I want to explain to your listening audience is what happens when we get filled up this way. Well, it's uncomfortable. It feels intense. Sometimes it's scary because we don't feel we're in control of our emotions. Oftentimes, it causes anxiety because we really don't understand why we're feeling so intensely. So it's uncomfortable. So what do we do? Well, as human beings, we focus inwardly on how we're feeling and try to do something about it. Now, what we do can vary in 100 ways. We can try to get it off our chest, or write it in a journal, or we could go for a run to get rid of the energy, or watch TV in order to, just distract ourselves. We go down and punch a punching bag if you need to. But, the point I'm trying to make is when we're filled up, and this is true for adults as well as children, we're focused inwardly, which means by definition, we are not focused outwardly. And what I mean by that is that we are not really hearing what other people are saying to us. You know, a person can give you the most calm, logical explanation for why you shouldn't feel or needn't feel the way you do. We don't hear it. If we're really filled up, and like if we're really angry, for instance, we may hear that 5% that supports our anger, or some tone of voice in what the person's saying that somehow supports our anger, and we get angrier. You know, the the person who's trying to explain they persist and they keep trying to explain, and the person doesn't hear it. They're just getting angrier. So finally, the person throws up their hands and say, "I can't talk to you." It's like talking to a brick wall. That's a very common phrase, between spouses. It's like talking to a brick wall. You know, so obviously, what I'm getting at, spouses have to be able to empty each other out as well as empty their children out. In order to do that, they have to be a soothing presence, be able to respond to their children or to their spouse rather than just react with their own stress. Because if the person keeps trying to be logical and explain things and the other person is still very angry at them for whatever reason, or just plain angry, that fills up the person who's trying to explain. So
Hmm.
now you have two people both trying to be heard, and nobody can hear. Nobody's listening. So you listen to me. No, you listen to me. No, you listen to me.
Hmm.
This is a mess. It just gets worse. It's a vicious cycle, and if it goes on and persists over time, people say, well, I'm not even going to try to talk to this person because, what's the point? There's no point. And that's where walls build up between couples, between parents and their children, until there's no communication, no effective communication. So it leaves parents, for instance, only in the position of being able to react to their children's behavior, all right? Because they don't have access to their emotions, their emotional perceptions. So they simply try to do it behaviorally. And then they go into a lecture about, why the child's getting a consequence. Not then it gets to the emptying out phase. And so the child, I'll get into punishment and discipline a little later, but it's not helpful. You're not helping your child to become what we call emotionally resilient. Resilience is being able to cope with the stresses of your emotional experiences successfully. And children can't do that without the help of their parents. And the parents need to be a soothing presence to help the child first, initially, when they're young, to develop an emotional language. How many times have, parents turn to their child and say, don't hit your brother. Use your words. Use your words. Well, I'm here to tell you that's a skill. That doesn't just happen because parents says use your words. It happens through practice with the
Mm.
parent, you know. And so I'll tell you a little anecdote. I was seeing two boys, 7 and 9. They were brothers, and I was talking to mom for a few minutes in my office, and they were out in the waiting room. And all of a sudden, we heard a scream, outside. And so we both jump up and go into the waiting room. And the 9-year-old's holding his arm in tears, and the 7-year-old's got a look on his face like, oh, I'm in big trouble. So the mom's asking, what happened? And I'm observing this because I'm the psychologist, and that's what I do. And the 9-year-old says, he bit me. And he lifts up his shirt, and there are teeth marks on his arm. I mean, his brother really bit him. Now, I felt so bad for the mom. Here she is in the child psychologist's office, and, her kids are biting one another. She's mortified. And she turns to the 7-year-old and says, I told you to use your words. And he looked at her in all innocence and said, I don't know how. And I
Mm.
said to mom, that's where we need to go. Little children hold temper tantrums. They don't have the words, so they act on their emotions behaviorally. That's what a tantrum is. Over the course of time, they've got to learn how to develop an emotional language so they can use their words. Because let's face it, a 5-year-old throwing a temper tantrum is something we can control. An 18-year-old without an emotional language and who's reacting behaviorally to his anger, that could be jail time. Some
Mm.
place in between, they've got to learn how to use their words and have an emotional language, and that's up to the parents. So let me get to what happens when we're filled up. I explained that. What's evident is that in order to help a child or a spouse or a friend, whoever it is who's feeling emotional intensity, we have to help them to empty out. Now, here's the rub, as Shakespeare said. We, when I just described you as somebody trying to empty out not really trying to empty them out, they're simply giving an explanation and not really asking the person to empty out and talking about their emotions. And so emptying out actually has to, as the person who's doing the emptying out has to be calm, soothing, like I said. They have to ask open-ended questions and mirror back what they heard. You know, My guess is you're really angry. Something's making it really tough for you. What's making it tough? I like using the word tough rather than actually the word anger because they'll define how they're feeling. We know it's tough because we can see it, you know? Yes, I'm upset because my best friend was yelling at me in front of all the others and I was embarrassed. Okay, tell me about that, I'm hearing that you were embarrassed. Tell me about being embarrassed, you know? And over the course of doing this with children come up with their own definitions for their emotions. And that's where we get into developing a common emotional language, which means this, I'll give you an example. I had a boy, he was 8, really angry at his mom. Mom would lecture him. So I asked him, well, what word would you use to describe how you feel when mom is lecturing you again? It makes me volcano mad, Dr. Marcus, volcano mad, like I'm going to erupt. Okay. How about what would be a less anger? Something that makes you less angry. If a volcano mad is, 10 out of 10, what would be like a 2 or 3 out of 10? And he said, well, when she makes me eat my peas, I don't like that. That would be maybe a 2 or 3. Well, from then on, when he would describe things that were making him angry, for instance, I'd say, was that volcano mad or eat your peas mad? And he smiled and he said, this guy really gets me, because what I'm doing there is helping the child to process their emotions based on their experiences. And that's really important. They need to process their own experiences. And
Mm,
this is where parents, drop the ball.
okay. All right. So, Dr. Marcos, you teach parents to be a soothing presence. So that can be
Yes.
really hard to do, when your child is screaming and you are stressed. So how do parents stop their own anger from taking over in a moment like that?
Okay. First of all, if the child is really upset in that situation, parents know this. Remove the child from that situation. All right. The only, we got to get rid of whatever's stimulating the anger. All right. If you're at a store and they're throwing a temper tantrum, you leave the store, that type of thing. The only good thing about intense emotions is that they're expensive. The child can't keep it up forever. What the child really needs to know in those times is that the parent is okay with the fact that they are upset. In other words, what parents do, they get frazzled. Oh, you just shut up and why are you so mad and stop doing that. And so they're not soothing, they're just reacting themselves. What the child really needs to know, there's sort of an underneath message here. Young children experience their emotions very intensely. Why? Because they don't have the words, like I just said. And so they need to be able to borrow the parent's okayness. So if a child is throwing a tantrum or throwing things, have the parent hold them so they can't hurt themselves or break things. But while they're holding them, to use a calm voice and saying, "I'm here. I'm okay. I'm here. Whenever we can talk about it, I am okay. Your mom is okay." Because there's a underneath fear in children, especially young children. They experience their emotions so intensely, they're actually afraid it's going to drive their parents away. And that's really scary for young children. You know, I've helped parents. They call me on the phone. My son's throwing a tantrum. What do I do? I give them this advice, and the child begins to calm down, knowing that their parent is okay, even though they're not. So the worst thing a parent can do is just say, "I can't take you anymore. Just get out of my face," because that's actually exactly what the child is fearing. The parent is not available to them. They're on their own with all this intense emotion. That's scary. And it's also really hurts a child's self-esteem. My mom doesn't like me. My dad doesn't like me. That type of thing because of the reaction. Parents can get in the way of uh, emptying out the child in many ways. One of them, obviously, is what I just said, John. The one that really makes me sort of almost laugh is when parents say, go get control of yourself. What the parents really saying is, I can't control you, so get out of my face. That's what they're saying. But if the child could control himself, he would. He knows, children are geared to please their parents, and they know they're not pleasing their parents when they're throwing a temper tantrum, you know? So, parents fall down that way. Parents also, and this is going to sound kind of extreme coming from a child psychologist or a family psychologist, I wish I could get rid of the phrase make feel better from a parent's vocabulary. Make feel better. because what they do to try to make the child feel better does not work. I'll give you an adult example. If you have something that's really difficult for you and you go to a friend and you begin to tell them what's going on, and all of a sudden they jump in and say, "Oh, I went through the same thing, and this is what I did, and this is what you should do." You know, well, if it was a really good friend, you might say, "Just hear me out," because you need to get it from the filled up emotional space out where you can look at it. If it wasn't a good friend, you might thank that person and go find a good friend, to do this with. The difference here is children, they're geared to please their parents, at least below the age of like 10 or 11, below the tweens. And so they're not going to sit there when the parent does that and say, "Mom, will you just listen to me? Mom, will you just shut up and let me talk?" A 6-year-old's not going to do that. They're just going to sit there and go, uh-huh, and they'll be quiet because they know their parents want to talk. And so the parent feels like they handled the situation because the child's not quiet. Well, 3 days later, something similar happens and the child's just as upset as they were 3 days ago. "I thought we talked about this." No, you didn't. You talked at the child, but you didn't talk with the child. And you didn't help to empty out and learn from their own experience. So that's one way they get in the way. That's very common. Another is make feel better or make him laugh. So he'll feel better. That doesn't empty out anything. Well, I'll distract him. Go watch a video. That doesn't do anything at all as far as developing an emotional language. You know, this is what parents are up against these days, and they don't know any better. All right. So if it wouldn't make you as an adult feel better if somebody did any of those things, why would it make your child feel any better? It does not work, and it does not help the child become resilient emotionally.
All
Do you have
right.
any?
All
Uh-huh.
right. Yeah, so Dr. Marcus, for the parent listening right now whose child is in the middle of a tantrum or a shutdown. So what's the one thing they should not say if they want to de-escalate the situation?
Uh, okay. Let's get into that's what you're asking me. Let's get into the emptying out. Okay, the child is throwing his tantrum. Parent, I'm okay. I'm okay. The child begins to calm down. You know, and either the parent turns to the child, assuming the child already has an emotional language. We should, I just gave you an example of how to develop that. Earlier examples I can give you, but let's assume for now we're dealing with a 6 or 7-year-old who has some emotional language. And you say, something happened that made it really hard for you. The words something and hard are the active words in that sentence. Something, we want the child to define what it is. We don't want to say, "Oh, I think it was this," or "I think it was that." Hard is like the word tough. We know it's hard, but we don't know if it's hard making him angry, or is he angry because he's really sad and he's hiding his anger, or is he really anxious, and this is causing his behavior. We have to have the child explain those things with his own emotional language or her own emotional language. So let's say, and so the child says, "Yeah," and then I'll give you an example. Parent, where's my son came home from off the bus. He was so angry. I didn't know what was going on. I tried to empty him out and it didn't work. He was obviously, and they didn't really do it right. So I talked to the child myself. Uh, it was actually on the phone, because that was when the difficulty was happening. And it turns out from my letting him explain what was tough, that it wasn't so much the anger about his friend on the bus. It was the fact that, kids were teasing him on the bus and his best friend joined in and it really hurt his feelings. And that's what was driving his behavior. That's why he was so angry. It had little to do with what the teasing had some to do with the teasing, but it had more to do with his friend joining in and how hurt he was. And once I heard that, I conveyed that to the parents could empty him out more effectively and could help him to deal with, you know, what to do next once he was emptied out. Let me get to the emptying out part of this because that's what you're audience is really going to want to hear. I'm giving you some examples. The thing that needs to be understood is emptying out occurs on three different levels. And this is also part of Parent RX. Three levels, they're the three levels of emotional intensity. I'll put it that way. The most obvious level is what I call the here and now level. The here and now level, we have lots of words for because it's the logical part. And I always use a simple example to show what I mean. Okay, you need to take out the garbage. We have lots of words to describe why the garbage should go out. It's getting full. The trash man comes tomorrow. This is your responsibility. It's beginning to smell bad. This is easy, but it's much different when we go down to the next level, which is I call the history level. And here's the example. This is the sixth time I've asked you to take out the garbage and you haven't done it. Now, obviously, the person who's asking, typically the parent, is going to be much more intense, frustrated, having to ask for six times, right? But if you were a stranger and watching the interaction, you'd say, what's the big deal? Why are you getting so angry? So he didn't take out the garbage. You see, the logic begins to break down there. But a lot of the intensity comes from that level. It's the, oh, here we go again level, in other words. Right? The deepest level is what I call the tapped into level. The fact that you didn't take out the garbage when I asked you six times means you don't listen to me. I really hate when people don't listen to me. You know, I was the youngest of three, and my older brother and sister, they didn't listen to me either. And they took up all of the space, and my parents always talked to them and didn't want to talk to me. I hate that. So this last level can go anywhere, depending on, you know, the person's actual experiences. And that's where a lot of the intensity comes from. And so emptying out on these other two levels is very important because the logical level only is very shallow, like I explained to you. It doesn't really get to much. But the history level, we know when somebody's emptying out on the history level of when they say things like, you always do this, or you never do that. Now they're referring to previous events. Tell me about that. Tell me when it's happened before. Well, da da da, or tell me how it's, something that I never do that you wish I did. You see? Um, and the tapped into level is when you do that, I get so many, this is where you get to the emotional words. Tell me about how frustrated you are, sometimes with me, as your parent. We're getting very, very close to discipline here. But we might just segue into it. But the three levels of it are very important to empty out all three levels and to keep mirroring back what you hear. Don't sum it up. Don't put a synopsis on it. Don't give your own spin on it. Don't tell them, well, I went through it too. Misery loves company. No, none of that works. Don't give them platitudes. Oh, sometimes life is tough. Thanks a lot. That means nothing. You know what I mean? But parents do all this stuff because they want to make their child feel better. I understand that, but it doesn't work. And it doesn't help the child become resilient and be emotionally expressive and have an emotional language, all the things that are so important. Because when we talk about resilience in children, if the child can process their own experience and learn from those experiences, once you empty out a child, now they can hear the logic. Now they can say, well, why don't we think about how we can deal with this better? And notice the we. It's not the child, you do this, you do that. I'm here for you. This is a merger experience. I'm going to help you with this. Now you're on the child's side rather than the person pointing a finger saying, this is what you should and shouldn't do, and this is why you're getting punished, da 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 da. So it's a much different dynamic between the parents and the child. And over the course of time, the child will take in that soothing presence and that language. They'll take it in. It's called a process. It's called internalization. They'll actually take in that soothing presence, and now they can soothe themselves. Now, in children, that's called resilience, like I said. But if it persists and it keeps going, into adulthood. In adulthood, that's called stress tolerance. And we all know how important a piece of maturation is, what we call stress tolerance. So this is a wonderful legacy to pass down to your children. And it
Mhm.
really helps them to cope. But now you've showed them this is the way we parent. And guess what? They'll be a soothing parent, a
Mm.
presence for their own children. You
All
see?
right. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Marcos. That was a very, very insightful response. So, to wrap up, for our listeners who want to go check out your book, Parent RX, or learn more about your strategies, so where is the best place for them to go?
Go to my website, parentrx.org, PARENTRX, one word, parentrx.org, or my email address there is dsmarcusphd, dsmarcusphd at parentrx.org. ORG.
All right, Dr. Marcos, it's been a truly insightful conversation with you, and I am very excited to have you come share your insight with us on the show today. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. You take care.